Codex Sinaiticus contains what is probably the oldest complete copy of the New Testament, written in the original language of the New Testament documents, that is, Greek. It is a book mostly made up of quires of 8 leaves, each page containing 4 columns of script. When opened, the 8 columns would appear similar to the even more familiar sequence of columns in a papyrus roll. It is made of vellum parchment, and may originally have measured, when opened, about 16 by 28 inches, a large book, which present-day librarians would put on the oversize shelf. This celebration of the Codex Sinaiticus is a fitting climax to the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible. The aim of the King James Bible had been to provide an English translation for liturgical use which was based on the original languages of Hebrew and Greek, instead of the Latin Vulgate, which had been the only version of the Bible available in the West for some 12 centuries. Unfortunately, however, there were very few Greek manuscripts of the New Testament available to the translators, and these were all late, no earlier than the 12th century. So during the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars were on the lookout for earlier Greek copies of the New Testament, in libraries and particularly monasteries and churches. However, the discovery of many more manuscripts, and subsequently lots of papyri fragments of New Testament writings, raised fresh problems. For copies often depart from the version copied. The copyist, almost any copyist, makes mistakes. He misses out phrases or unwittingly repeats phrases. He improves the style of the earlier version, or adds a clarificatory note, or corrects a text where he assumes an earlier error has been made. As an oversimplification, one can generally take it for granted that the later the textual copy, the more mistakes it will have absorbed. Consequently, the hunt, particularly in the 19th century, was for earlier manuscripts, in the hope that they would be most free from such errors, alterations, or improvements, the most reliable witnesses to the text of the New Testament, which the evangelists and Paul, etc., actually dictated or wrote. This is where the Codex Sinaiticus comes in, including the drama of its discovery by Constantine Tischendorf. Tischendorf was a noted biblical scholar who spent his academic career at the University of Leipzig. His passion was textual criticism, the compelling desire to collate as accurately as possible the wide variety of readings available in the manuscript tradition. He willingly travelled far afield to check known manuscripts and to uncover more, and he paid several visits to St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai in Egypt. There, in a visit in 1859, under the patronage of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, he was shown what came to be known, because of its place of discovery, as Codex Sinaiticus, a Greek manuscript of the complete New Testament and parts of the Old Testament, which dated from the 4th century. He was able to secure the Codex, in circumstances which are still disputed, and was able to present it to the Tsar, at whose cost it was published in 1862. The history of the adventures of Codex Sinaiticus did not end there, for it was kept in the Imperial Library in St. Petersburg, and became a victim of the Russian Revolution. In 1933, however, the Soviet government, recognizing the value of the Codex to others, if not to themselves, sold it for £100,000 to the British Museum, half the sum being donated by the British government and half raised by public subscription. It now resides in the British Library, one of its greatest treasures. The Codex was almost certainly written in the 4th century, probably between 325 and 360. According to Tischendorf, Codex Sinaiticus was one of the 50 copies of the Bible commissioned by the Roman Emperor Constantine after his conversion to Christianity. And certainly the cost of making the Codex implies a very wealthy sponsorship, for the vellum parchment of the Codex is made from donkey or antelope skin, and it has been reckoned that about 360 animals must have been slaughtered to provide the necessary parchment. Unfortunately, the Codex in the British Library is not the whole Codex. The British Library portion consists of nearly 350 pages, more than half of the whole, but smaller sections are held elsewhere. Of interest is the fact that the Old Testament writings include the Apocrypha, and with the New Testament are included 2 of the Apostolic Fathers, the Epistle of Barnabas and part of the Shepherd of Hermas. The order of the New Testament books is also of interest. The 4 Gospels, the Epistles of Paul, with Hebrews following 2 Thessalonians, then the Acts of the Apostles, the general epistles, and the book of Revelation. The discovery of Codex Sinaiticus, 1859, came at an appropriate time, for the two great Cambridge textual scholars, Westcott and Hort, had already begun an enterprise which lasted for 28 years to produce the best Greek text of the New Testament as was possible, which they published in 1881. Westcott and Hort recognized that in the Codex Sinaiticus they had a supreme treasure. Its only comparator was, and is, Codex Vaticanus, stored in the Vatican Library, which is sufficiently similar in script and layout to make one wonder whether the two codices were produced under the same or similar patronage at about the same time and for similar purposes. At any rate, Westcott and Hort identified these two great 4th century manuscripts as their primary authorities and established their text of the New Testament principally by following their lead. Where Sinaiticus and Vaticanus were in agreement, that usually settled the text, and subsequently textual critics have mostly followed their lead. In fact, the Westcott and Hort text has been the basis for almost all critical editions of the Greek New Testament for the past century. What then is the importance of Codex Sinaiticus in the history of Christianity? Let me give 5 answers. First, the Bible, the New Testament in particular, is the canon, the measuring rod, by which the faith of the Christian Church is determined. The Bible, the New Testament, defines Christianity as no other document or set of documents do. It is therefore vital that we know what the New Testament in particular says, what the apostles actually said and wrote. It is essential then, as Tischendorf and the other textual critics fully realized, to get as close as possible to the text of the New Testament which its writers intended. And with the Codex Sinaiticus, we have one of the best witnesses to that text. Without Codex Sinaiticus and its partner, Codex Vaticanus, we would be much more in the dark as to the text of the New Testament, as to what the New Testament writers actually wrote. We would be much less confident that we know what was the faith uniquely revealed in the Holy Scriptures. Codex Sinaiticus is a major pillar of Christian faith. Second, Codex Sinaiticus illustrates an important historical development, which has only become clear in the last century, that Christian desire to put together the 4 Gospels and the Pauline epistles in single collections probably was the major motivation in the transition in the early centuries from the scroll to the book, the latter so much easier to use in public reading. Codex Sinaiticus is a prime example of the early book. Third, this also reminds us of the importance of liturgy in Christian history. Given its size when open, Sinaiticus was almost certainly intended for liturgical reading on a lectern in a church. This would explain the high quality of the Codex itself, and also the care taken to reproduce the text with accuracy, which has made the Codex of such value to New Testament scholars. Fourth, Codex Sinaiticus is sufficiently early and careful in its copying of earlier copies to indicate to us that some passages which became established in the later manuscripts of the New Testament were not part of the original text. Good examples are the longer ending to Mark's Gospel and the doxology which has ended the Lord's Prayer for nearly 1900 years. This, however, raises one more point of significance. For Sinaiticus is itself a witness to the fact that the text of the New Testament was not fixed and static. It reminds us that there were subsequent additions which became established parts of the New Testament, like the ends of the Lord's Prayer. But Sinaiticus itself has many scribal annotations, corrections, clarifications, added by subsequent and different scribal hands. Such variations attest that the New Testament was not regarded as a dead tradition from many decades earlier, a sacred relic from the past only to be venerated, but was seen as a living tradition, speaking also to subsequent generations. Such variations attest not so much the importance of the text as such, but what the text expresses, the word contained in and speaking through the words. In a quite proper sense, there is no single text of the New Testament, but many versions of it, which is a reminder to us that there are different ways of saying what is the same thing. So it saves us from a kind of bibliolatry, which reverence for the King James Bible was in some danger of falling into in the 20th century. In short, Codex Sinaiticus is of considerable importance in the history of Christianity, in that it is a prime witness both to the New Testament and to the character of the New Testament.